actually the last Shabbat of 2018, as has come to be tradition here over the last 4 years, I guess, 4 years or so. We have used that Shabbat as an opportunity not to deliver a sermon, but rather to open it up to something we call Ask the Clergy. And anyone who's in attendance is welcome to ask any question they've ever had a burning desire to ask a clergy person. And this past, the 2018 Ask the Clergy was pretty epic. It was. Would you agree, Cantor Goldstein? Raise your hand if you were in attendance at that, right? So I don't know about you all, but Cantor Goldstein and I are still exhausted by the intensity of the questions that were asked. In past years, the questions have been like very light, like what's your favorite food or things like this. And this year, the questions were just immensely profound. And in many ways, I don't know about you, but for me, many of them have still been running through my head as they really bring to bear, I think, pretty critical ideas. And I wanted to share one of those questions that was asked with us, with you tonight, as a way of moving into what I'd like to think is a better answer than the one I gave on December 28th or whatever it was, one that I've had a little more time to think about. So for those of you who were there, you know that one of the questions was asked from a college student, a young woman who is at a college where she is one of very few Jewish people, and she raised her hand and asked how she should respond to friends on campus who ask her what compelling reason or motivation she has to practice Judaism when there is not the incentive of the promise of an afterlife. Shabbat shalom. So, this is a really fascinating question, and it's one that for this young woman was at top of mind because her encounter in this freshman year of campus life was really, she was, for many of the people she met, the first Jewish person they had ever met. And when it came down to opportunities to ask questions of differences of faith, this issue of what's the incentive in Judaism to practice Judaism if you don't have the explicit promise of an afterlife was really something that was weighing heavily on her shoulders. And so first, to clarify just a few things, it's not that there are not theories of afterlife in Judaism. There certainly are. But stressed throughout our history is that those are secondary motivations, that the real ROI, or the return on the investment of living Jewishly, is experienced here, in this life, in the here and now. And the structure, or the vehicle that makes that possible, is what we know as the mitzvot, the gift of countless commandments, or ways in which we are invited to bring holiness into the world. And some of the most important of those are detailed in this week's Torah portion, Mishpatim. So a little context to understand it. Mishpatim, which follows immediately after the Torah portion that details the giving of the Ten Commandments, roots us into what it means to live a Jewish life in a more practical, specific way than the lofty 35,000-foot view of the Ten Commandments. You can think of it this way. If the Ten Commandments give us the principles, Mishpatim gives us the case studies for how to apply each principle in the real tachlis of life. In particular, those moments where, when left to our own human instincts, we tend to muck it up. We tend to fail. These moments that perhaps this is familiar to you, when our egos hinder us from helping someone else to the best of our ability. Those moments where selfishness erodes our tendency toward justice. Those moments when we falter in protecting the vulnerable and the marginalized. Covering a range of topics from the treatment of slaves and servants to loan procedures to the very exciting topic of tort law, to the rules, I'm being sarcastic, not very exciting at all, tort law, to the rules of the court system. When you put all of these together, the laws of Mishpatim offer a detailed and compulsory moral code built not around a blind faith and trust in God that things will work out all right, but rather a moral code tied entirely to personal and communal responsibility. Much of this code is known to us, explicitly or conceptually, that we are to care for those who have no one else to care for them, namely the widow, the orphan, and the needy, that we're forbidden to exploit them, that we're forbidden from taking advantage of our own people and not unduly benefiting from them, that we're not supposed to charge interest to a fellow Jew, that we're expected to speak the truth and not to participate in rumor spreading or lying, that we are to hold ourselves to the highest standards of fairness, in particular in justice, that we must not let rivalries blind us to the importance of lending a hand when needed. Of note is that each of these commandments is listed in this very large Torah portion, not spread out across it, but rather one after the other in a specific section, and their presentation bunched together emphasizes just how critical treating each other with dignity and respect is from a Jewish vantage. If we don't look out for each other, who will, right? And it's from this notion that the Talmud derives the concept, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh. All Jewish people are responsible for each other. This is foundational to what it means to be a part of the Jewish community. But here is the striking part. This section of intra-communal obligation is literally framed or bookended by a singular concept, not about how we treat our fellow Jews, but rather about extra-communal obligation, in particular, how we Jews should treat the stranger and the outsider in our midst. Sound familiar? Yeah. I think you'll hear maybe more about this, I'm guessing, tomorrow from Hannah. I think you'll have your own take, though, right? So listen for a moment to how this goes. The verse, right before the list of intracommunal laws, begins as follows. Do not mistreat a stranger or oppress him. You likely know the next part. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Exactly. So that was amazing. Here, this motivation for not mistreating the stranger is linked to our own personal experience of repression and oppression. The 13th century commentator Nachmanides takes a moment to note that in society, and we know this to be true too, the stranger proves the most powerless person. With no familial or even communal support system to defend him or her, it would be easy or even instinctual for us as those in power to assert unwarranted authority over the stranger. But this sort of behavior from a Jewish vantage is anathema, namely because we've been there and we should know better. Taking advantage of those with the least power might be a human tendency, but our tradition understands it as decidedly un-Jewish because it turns the Jew into a pharaoh. Thus, we need the prohibition. And so then follows this list, this really extensive list of intracommunal obligations. And then when it's over, you get the second articulation of this same commandment, literally the same, except one additional clause is concluded. It says, do not oppress the stranger. Here's the addition. You yourselves know the soul of the stranger because you were strangers in Egypt. This addition of our knowing the soul of the stranger ups the ante on the concept, and it invites us to reflect not on just the responsibility that comes with having power, but also how that awareness should call us to emotional empathy, because we know the experience of being oppressed, because we know the emotional vulnerability of the stranger. The stranger is one who lives outside the normal securities of home and belonging. He or she is and feels alone. And so whereas a lack of empathy for the other might also be a human tendency or instinct, Judaism understands it as decidedly un-Jewish because it turns the Jew into a Pharaoh, thus the articulation of the second prohibition. Of note is that in all 53 commandments articulated in Mishpatim, only one is repeated twice, and it is this one. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks puts it this way: dislike of the unlike is as old as mankind. This fact lies at the very heart of the Jewish experience. The Torah asks, why should you not hate the stranger? Because you once stood where he stands now. You know to the heart of the stranger because you were once a stranger in the land of Egypt. If you are human, so is he. If he is less than human, so are you. There is only one reply strong enough to answer the question, why should I not hate the stranger? Because the stranger is me. It turns out that how successful we are in our treatment of the stranger is the key predictor in how successful we will be with our treatment of each other, because both are, or at least should be, reflections of how we will treat ourselves. That a just and compassionate society is measured not solely by how the insiders treat each other, but by how the insiders treat the outsiders. Because at the end of the day, when we apply the binaries of us and them, native and foreigner, citizen and stranger, as justification for mistreatment or oppression, no less the withholding of care or love, we not only break this prohibition, we negate the divine fabric into which we are all, each and every one of us, woven. As the renowned 19th century Rabbi Israel Salanter put it, first a person should put his house together, then his town together, and then the world. And expanding circles of obligation that may be most easily held in the center, the perceived point closest to us. But those responsibilities do not end until the wide expanse of the world is encircled in our embrace. It is true that in the grand scheme of religious incentive plans, it can seem that Judaism missed the boat a little. But don't be too sure, because what we do offer is a guide to living in this life that invites us to make a choice, to live by instinct as animals, or to aspire to the highest aspirations of our human potential, called to be different, called to reach higher, called to be nothing less than God's hands in healing and restoring wholeness to God's creation. Why wait for heaven when we have all the tools necessary to bring it down to earth? That's our motivation, because at the end of the day, Jewish living isn't a destiny or a finish line, but a dynamic act of mutual responsibility and accountability in which we dedicate ourselves to the sacred work that makes for the promise of a better and brighter day, here, today, and tomorrow.